From the moment he was born, the boy had already shattered his parents' only hope. He came into the world with his right arm missing. Not only did his father despise him, his own mother spent every day telling him he had no reason to keep living. All because the family's greatest rival, Kagan, had been born with extraordinary gifts. By the age of 5, Davin had just learned how to grip a sword, but Kagan had already mastered advanced swordsmanship. His mother couldn't face reality and drowned herself in alcohol every day. His father eventually ran out of patience and sold Davin for 30 gold coins to the family's sworn enemy to be used as a servant. Kagan already couldn't stand the sight of him. Every single day he tied Davin to a post in the snow, whipped him bloody, and mocked him, telling him he was born to be a failure. Davin was a branch member of the family. Not one of the elders stood in his corner. A one-armed boy sold by his own father to his family's enemy, beaten daily in the snow. By any reasonable measure, the universe owed this kid an apology. As Kagan's abuse grew more savage, beating him until his head split open before stopping, something quietly took root inside Davin, the desire to become strong. He practiced swordsmanship every single moment he had, dreaming of the day he would grind that person beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Kagan trained lazily, indulging in pleasures and distractions. But even so, his natural talent alone was enough to crush Davin effortlessly. That didn't shake Davin's determination to surpass him, not even slightly. And that day finally came. At the annual sword assembly, Davin was selected to face Kagan in a challenge match, the boy they had beaten in the snow every day for years. Standing on a stage, sword in hand, the audience had no idea what they were about to witness. He was no longer that weak, helpless child. No matter how wildly Kagan swung his sword, Davin deflected every strike without effort. Then his eyes suddenly turned fierce. He raised his greatsword and brought it down with full force. A streak of purple sword energy erupted forward, its light searing Kagan's eyes. In that split second of distraction, Davin had already flashed directly above him. One devastating downward slash. Kagan managed to raise his sword and barely block, but the force was overwhelming. A thunderous explosion rang out as the shockwave from the impact engulfed the entire arena. When the smoke finally cleared, Davin had his sword pressed against Kagan's throat. The audience erupted. This was his first victory over Kagan in 80 consecutive defeats. 80 losses, 1 win. And he chose the most public possible stage to end the streak. That's not revenge, that's theater. You were just born luckier than me. If I were you, I would never be the attack dog of someone like you, you pathetic loser. Davin delivered his verdict, turned around, and walked off the stage. Then his pupils suddenly contracted. Kagan despicably had lunged from behind with his sword, but Davin faced it with a smile, because he had proven it. Even a one-armed crab could defeat a direct bloodline member. However, the one hailed as the greatest of the Samyeon family declared that anyone who defied them would face certain death regardless of who they were. Just as Davin lost consciousness, a mysterious figure appeared. Every time this man was tormented by his brother, his strength grew by 1 measure. By the age of 29, he had reached the absolute peak. He defeated the brother who had once beaten him, daily rising from the weakest broken-armed boy to a sword master revered by the world. But the despicable Kagan drove his blade through Davin's chest. Just as death was closing in, the holy maiden capable of healing all things appeared. Thanks to her power, Davin's life was preserved. But when he opened his eyes, he was bound to a chair. The prison warden raged at him. "You filthy crab, to defeat Lord Kagan, you made a pact with the devil and sacrificed 300 innocent children as a blood offering. I have sealed all your power, and by the honor of the family, you are sentenced to life imprisonment." Davin just smiled. Of course, he defeated Kagan, but he forgot to defeat the entire Samyeon family. Classic oversight. He was locked away in prison. Then Kagan appeared. "My dear brother, thanks to you, I have become a sword master. Losers will always be losers." He then deliberately cut Davin's food rations. In the end, Davin died in prison, starved to death in humiliation. But the moment he fully died, he felt pain in his right arm, and there was an old man in front of him cursing and lecturing him. Then a flood of memories surged into his mind. Wait, why am I Vincent? The 7th son of the Adenka family. The old man saw Vincent turn away without responding and moved to discipline him. But Davin's killing intent flooded his entire body. One palm strike to the chest sent the man flying 10 meters. He had been dead for approximately 30 seconds and had already assaulted someone. Reincarnation speed run. The force shocked even Davin himself. He hurried over to help the man up, but the old man didn't appreciate it. Instead, he warned him, "Don't think being direct bloodline means you can do whatever you want. My son will defeat you one day. Just wait and become the laughingstock of the direct line." Davin recognized those words. They were what his father had said, and the result was that he became a failure. But Davin didn't think too hard about it. From the start, he assumed this was all just a dream. Then more memories began flooding in. The original owner of this body had lost his mother the moment he was born. His father treated him with complete indifference, and his daily life was identical to Davin's past, treated as a failure and abused mercilessly. He searched the bookshelf and found a diary. Davin understood he had been reincarnated. Someone who wanted to die had given up on everything. Someone desperate to live had been accidentally reborn. Davin's eyes suddenly blazed with fierce light. "Who the hell are you? Show yourself right now. A divine being materialized before him. His name was Julian, the original owner of Vincent's body. He explained that he had originally intended to summon the Elf King to help, but through a series of mistakes, Davin had gotten involved instead. Julian was currently only a minor deity. To become a true god, he needed to accumulate more achievements. Davin said he had zero interest in achievements. He had been given a new life, and all he wanted was to live peacefully. Julian immediately threatened him with his life. If my divine power disappears, this body you're inhabiting dies with it. Davin didn't believe him, but Julian slightly reduced his divine energy, and Davin's body suddenly became unbearably heavy, collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Come, I will give you all my memories now. A bolt of lightning struck Vincent's body. A tragic memory flooded in, but Davin immediately saw through it. Julian was just acting weak, preparing the groundwork for his own revenge plan. Davin woke up in a cold sweat and complained, "What kind of insane world is this?" Julian smiled with barely concealed mischief. You know the story of Davin, the great demon and hero King Kagan? Nearly 1 billion people were deceived by that murderer. He didn't just lie to the entire nation to become a sword master. He fabricated history, framed Davin, who was locked in prison, claimed he killed 100,000 prison clan members and escaped, made pacts with devils and killed 80 million innocent souls, and then issued a wanted notice and teamed up with the greatest sword saint of the era to go hunt down Davin, the Demon King. Davin exploded with fury. Those Samian family scum, I was literally murdered by them, and they turned me into a demon king in the history books. Julian said this was simply what the history of the Holy Record Keepers documented. No need to get so worked up. But I don't remember anyone called a sword saint in my era. Julian said that was Adenka's founder Aslan, so that troublesome kid was the first family head. Before Davin died, Aslan had been his #1 devoted follower. After Davin was imprisoned, Aslan had repeatedly spoken out in anger and sworn he would absolutely get justice. But after that, Davin never saw him again. He had assumed Aslan was quietly killed. Julian interrupted, and that is exactly why the ancestor left behind the supreme mission: to surpass the Samian family and destroy their descendants for 18 generations in Davin's name. Davin gripped the holy sword. He understood Aslan had abandoned his own family to restore Davin's honor and built the Adenka family from the ground up for that purpose. But now that mission would be completed by Davin himself. Then that feeling came again. His body became unbearably heavy and he lost consciousness once more. When Davin woke up, he immediately channeled energy to treat this useless body. Suddenly, his eyes went wide. This flow of magical power, how is it possible here? Julian, get out here now. Julian floated over drowsily. Davin grabbed his arm immediately, completely baffled. This body had a perfect conduction skeleton, so why had it never practiced swordsmanship? Julian said he was simply not born suited for sword practice, and it had nothing to do with wanting to die anyway. Davin couldn't explain it properly, but beyond establishing a stellar image, a conduction skeleton could store magical power in the bones and use that power without limit. In their era, warriors demonstrated their strength through stellar images. The more stars, the stronger the warrior. And Kagan's terrifying power came entirely from having this exact type of conduction skeleton. But Julian reminded him this body couldn't naturally establish a heart image to store power in the heart. Davin ignored this immediately and drew his weapon. He knew that half of all people died attempting to establish a heart image. But even with 50% odds right now, he had to take the gamble. Seeing that Davin wanted to keep going, Julian rushed forward to stop him, completely baffled at why someone with this much power would refuse to learn proper technique. Even the most seasoned warriors wouldn't dare use power as recklessly as this. Davin said this was exactly how he trained in his past life. Yes, he might die from a twisted circuit, but there was a 50% chance it worked. Julian's lungs were practically combusting. There was a perfectly good instruction manual for using magical power, and this man chose to figure it out through trial and near-death experience. Davin lay down on the bed calmly. What he said next left Julian speechless. Although Vincent's body had an extraordinary conduction circuit for 13 years, not a single drop of magical power had been channeled into the bones. Without intervention before this body even reached adulthood, Vincent was facing only one outcome: death. Davin immediately channeled energy to forcibly halt the body's deterioration. The trade-off was his lifespan reducing at double the rate, but he said the 10 years remaining was more than enough to put the Adenka family's boot on top of the Samian family's neck. Just then, a servant burst through the door, saw Davin sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by complete chaos, and shouted that he was probably practicing dark magic again and would be reported to the head immediately. Davin just threw his clothes at the servant and told him to bring a clean set and clean up the room. The servant froze. The Vincent he knew was a coward. This person in front of him was completely different. The servant shouted back again. Davin cut him off flatly. Didn't I mention before that I hate unnecessary trouble more than anything? And yet here you are, a servant, shouting at me. If you don't want to do this job, that's perfectly fine. I'll go ask the head steward to come personally and deliver it while we have a detailed conversation about your little habit of being annoying. The servant's lungs nearly exploded with indignation, but he had no choice. He took the clothes and brought a clean set. Julian reminded Davin not to provoke that servant. He had a criminal background and had killed before. Davin said with the way that man had been acting, it was almost certainly just intimidation tactics to scare the previous Vincent. Davin had survived his entire life with people like that. Nobody had ever fooled his eyes. Julian was numb. He had originally planned to summon the Elf King. He was starting to think this person might be 1,000 times more terrifying. He had asked for a helper. He got a disaster that moved him permanently, only to be stabbed in the back by his own brother and locked in a filthy prison, indefinitely. More tragically, he was cut off from food and water for 48 days and starved to death. But his burning will to survive moved a deity, and Davin was reincarnated 500 years into the future, into a body with a conduction skeleton equal to Kagan's. And here, he was already causing trouble. He sat in the room waiting. The servant Wilson stormed back in furiously, threw the clean clothes to the side, and warned him never to make that kind of joke again. Davin agreed pleasantly. Wilson assumed he had submitted. Then Davin asked him to find a wooden practice arrow. Wilson refused immediately. Davin didn't push. Then I'll just go to the storage room myself. I hear the manager there is enormous and extremely loyal to the direct bloodline. Wilson grabbed his shoulder in a panic and begged for another chance. But the next second, Davin grabbed Wilson's wrist and channeled magical power, twisting until Wilson howled in pain. When it was done, Davin let go and told him plainly he had some bad memories related to attacks from behind. Wilson immediately swore he would never do it again, but then Davin broke into a cold sweat. He had accidentally channeled too much power and Vincent's weak body couldn't take it. Suddenly, Wilson stood up furious, ready to let loose on Davin's entire family tree, but Davin merely glanced at him once. Wilson immediately deflated, stood in place, muttering everything Davin had told him to remember, then spun around and bolted out the door, resuming his vicious expression the moment he was outside. He slammed the door shut with full force. Then, after a brief pause, quietly cracked it open just a sliver and whispered that all of this was the crazy person's fault and he hadn't meant any of it, then shut it again. Davin exhaled slowly and wondered if he had gone too far with the intimidation. Wilson came back carrying a wooden sword, furious, but resolved not to back down this time. He was going to make sure Davin remembered his name. Why does it have the character for inferior in it anyway? This is the wooden sword you wanted, but I'm sorry to say I can't simply hand it over that easily. Davin calmly closed his book and warmly told Wilson the legendary story of the one-armed Davin. Wilson's attitude flipped a complete 180 degrees. He held the sword with both hands and presented it obediently, then disappeared from view in an instant. With the wooden sword in hand, Davin went to the training ground to get reacquainted with his previous swordsmanship. But the moment he started swinging, he was already gasping for breath. This physical condition was genuinely difficult for Davin to work with, but he found it amusing. The burning sensation in his muscles felt like pure freedom. Then suddenly a streak of sword energy came from nowhere and split his training post clean in half. Davin turned and there was a blonde-haired boy standing there with a wooden sword. This cocky blonde boy had deliberately sabotaged Davin's training. He had used his power to split the training post in half. His name was Reza Denka, the strongest member of the branch family. Davin recognized immediately this was the son of that old man from before, and his purpose here was simple. In this era where everyone practiced martial arts, branch family children who reached 14 could enter the sword assembly, and the winner earned the right to challenge a direct bloodline member. Davin was that year's designated challenger. Ray's treating the weakest direct bloodline member as easy prey had come to give him an early warning. Davin didn't entertain him. A warrior who randomly interrupts someone else's training. Your father clearly raised you with great care. Ray's heard his father insulted and exploded, completely raised his wooden sword and struck Davin on the shoulder, demanding an immediate match. Julian immediately warned him Race already had 2 heart images established, making him a powerful warrior. On top of that, he had awakened an innate trait called Iron Will, which doubled both his defense and destructive power. In every measurable way, he far surpassed Davin's current state. Davin knew perfectly well that fighting Race right now would end in instant defeat, but there was one thing he absolutely could not allow. Davin raised his wooden sword. You dare issue a public challenge here? You're practically volunteering to get beaten at home. And yet, despite being a single-star warrior with no stellar image, no heart image, and no magical power whatsoever, something about Davin made Race's skin crawl. The feeling that this person could end him in an instant if he chose to. This was the killing aura Davin naturally radiated, refined over an entire lifetime of real combat. Race decided to drop it, but Davin kept going. A wooden sword scared you this badly? Wait until the sword assembly. That's real swords. You haven't forgotten, have you? Rise's anger spiked again. He launched himself at Davin with a full sword lunge. Julian went pale with terror, but Davin didn't even blink because he had already predicted every single move. Raze's personal bodyguard grabbed both his arms firmly and told him absolutely do not fight Vincent here. If he insisted, Vincent would have the perfect excuse to avoid the direct bloodline challenge. Rise was furious but restrained himself. He would wait until the sword assembly and deal with Davin properly then. Back in the room, Julian was fuming. He told Davin there was no reason to provoke Race on purpose. Their only priority right now was getting stronger as fast as possible. Davin said he simply wanted to educate an unruly child, then immediately told Julian Julian to teach him how to control magical power. A trait was something created through divine blessing by human will. The more perfectly a trait was refined, the more powerful magical circuits would open as a result. This was called techno-arts. Race's iron will had already been refined to an intermediate level capable of doubling his defense and destructive power simultaneously. Davin felt that developing only in one direction wasn't ideal. Julian said it was the fastest path to power available. Davin fell into thought. Raze was already this powerful from a single trait alone. Even if Raze wasn't at the sword assembly, other competitors would certainly be formidable. He had to get used to the reality of strengthening through traits immediately. When Davin arrived at the training ground again, several additional pairs of eyes were now watching him constantly. Then someone walked over and handed him a recovery potion. His name was Merlin, vice commander of the White Sword Corps. Davin didn't understand why Merlin would help him. Merlin admitted honestly he had looked down on Davin before too, but something had changed. He had seen Davin's absolute determination to grow stronger, and what it produced in him was nothing but respect. Davin thanked him for the potion but said he had to keep training. Merlin stepped back but quietly hoped real luck would find this person. Davin didn't know how many times he collapsed after that, then suddenly he felt it. Magical power inside his heart, and he could see the optimal trajectory of the gray arrow. He swung hard at the post and the post split clean in two. Davin was overjoyed. He had finally achieved it. Control of his own magical power, channeled and attached to the surface of the wooden sword. When Merlin returned to the training ground later, Davin had already left. But what Merlin saw stopped him cold. He couldn't believe how fast Davin had grown. Monster level, that was the only word for it. Meanwhile, Julian had pulled out a reference book on the upcoming sword assembly, containing not just every competitor's personal information but every technique they could use. Davin looked at it all, then made a bold decision. He told Julian what he was planning would be something that book couldn't account for, then summoned Wilson. Davin instructed Wilson to find a specific person and deliver a specific message. That person was his mother's personal attendant, a 7-star warrior named Rielsa. Wilson confidently pushed open the door. Rielsa immediately shot him a look. Wilson's legs nearly gave out, but he forced himself to deliver the message. Davin was inviting his father to attend the sword assembly that day. He would prove he was the strongest one there. Seeing Rielsa was reluctant to pass the message, Wilson pulled out the fact that he knew about Rielsa's private misuse of public funds, then bolted immediately. Rielsa couldn't believe Davin had discovered his secret, but in the end, he went and delivered the message to the city lord. The city lord immediately saw through the situation. Rielsa would only have dared relay this if Davin had threatened her. The city lord was annoyed, but this wasn't something he wanted to intervene in directly. Rielsa wasn't her servant, and honestly this had the feel of that woman's style. Davin's mother, Savannah. The city lord eventually relented. He will attend the sword assembly. A 14-year-old boy had awakened the trait every man in existence dreamed of possessing. He could freely control the hardness of any substance at will and layer it onto weapons to amplify their destructive power. An epic-level talent combining both offense and defense. And yet someone had declared they would face this opponent with nothing but a wooden sword. That someone was Davin. And this was the sword assembly for branch family members, with City Lord Kahan in attendance at Davin's personal invitation. After Rise easily won his first match, the crowd erupted in praise, already declaring that history of branch defeating direct bloodline was about to be made. Davin thought otherwise. In terms of martial arts, these people understood nothing. They moved like puppets on a page, relying entirely on awakened traits for their power. Impressive costumes. No substance underneath. Davin had seen this type in 2 lifetimes and was already bored. Raze fought his way through every opponent. The other branch children stood no chance against him. He won and earned the right to challenge Davin. Then Davin made a request to the referee that defied all common sense. Wilson stepped forward and handed Davin a wooden sword. Correct, Davin had decided to fight Race with a wooden sword. Standing in place. Right hand only, giving him 3 free strikes. Race immediately exploded. There's a limit to how far you can humiliate someone. The audience began booing. A wooden sword against Race? Was the weakest direct bloodline member actually insane? Race's father shouted from the stands that Davin was just setting up an excuse for a dignified loss. But the city lord agreed to the terms and warned Davin he had better prove it with action. The referee raised the flag. The match began. Race attacked first, taunting that Davin would die standing up. But Davin had already predicted this attack. He had spent months with Julian, completely breaking down Race's every move. He simply tilted his head and the strike passed harmlessly. Race thought Davin had taken the bait. He hadn't. Davin had known from the start it was a feint, and even with the reference book, Davin could see every hole in Race's technique with his eyes closed. The Iron Will trait was powerful. The person using it was full of gaps. Magical power gathered around Davin's hand, and with a casual deflection, he blocked Raze's second attack effortlessly. Raze was stunned. Even a 6-star warrior wouldn't dare block that directly. Then Raze swung his greatsword again, and in the next moment something extraordinary happened. Davin simply reached out and grabbed Raze's right wrist, then swept his heel, grabbed his collar and pressed him into the ground with complete ease. Raze coughed up blood, but looking at this devil-like presence above him, he instinctively scrambled backwards. I believe it's my turn to attack now. The city lord was quietly reconsidering everything he thought he knew about this boy. Race's father couldn't believe what he was seeing. He frantically encouraged himself that his son had simply stepped in something unfortunate unfortunate and told him to get up and destroy this no-power failure. But what they didn't understand, this single technique that Davin had just used was considered foundational in true martial arts, and they had no idea how much of himself Davin had poured into reaching that foundation across 2 lifetimes of practice. They called it basic. Ray suddenly narrowed his eyes. Could you possibly have a minor deity protecting you, helping you awaken an innate trait this quickly? Julian's lungs nearly exploded. Davin said flatly, the ignorant will always fall. Rise erupted with fury and swung his great cleaver directly at Davin. Julian saw disaster coming. Fury had just boosted Race's destructive power again, but Davin remained completely calm. One lateral sidestep avoided completely, then raised his wooden sword and delivered a fast slashing strike at Race's neck. The stone-grade wooden sword didn't seem to do much. Race's neck remained intact. Suddenly, from the stands, Race's father screamed, "Don't forget you have the golden unbreakable body, you idiot," cut him down. Davin knew that against an attack style this riddled with holes, it still wasn't time to use his full strength. He pushed the stone-grade wooden rod to 20 armor units and drove it straight into Race's abdomen. The force launched Race 10 meters backward instantly. Then Davin's eyes blazed cold. "Referee, you must be ready to stop a tragedy from occurring." The referee had no idea what this boy was talking about. Before he could ask, Davin had already flashed forward with a single step. This next strike would be his absolute full power. He had to finish Raze in midair. If he failed, he would fall unconscious. Raze recovered his footing and swung his great cleaver again, taunting Davin defiantly. Then Davin's expression shifted to something between shock and certainty. He saw Raze's sword path connect with his own. Davin immediately pushed his wooden sword to 99 armor units. "Julian, I will win back everything that belongs to you." A streak of sword energy flashed past in an instant. Blood erupted. With nothing but this wooden sword, Davin had severed Race's arm clean from his body. This was the highest domain of swordsmanship Davin had reached, twisting the magical flow to sever an enemy's every ability completely. The referee stepped forward with a formal apology. He had failed to stop the tragedy in time. Julian rushed forward, asking about Davin's condition. Davin said this wasn't the moment to collapse yet. The city lord officially announced Davin as the winner of the sword assembly and called him forward for the awards ceremony. The prize was an exceptionally rare magic crystal. Shoot it into your body and both power and magical energy would double instantly. Just as Davin was about to receive his reward, Race's father suddenly burst in, furiously accusing Davin of cheating his way to victory. The city lord asked what had happened. The priest stepped forward. There had been an unexpected complication. Race's severed right arm could not be reattached. This was a condition never seen before. They made their way to the treatment area, but Davin overheard the priest suggesting this might be the work of apostle dark magic and immediately stepped forward, requesting permission to address the situation through the city lord's authority. This sword assembly was conducted under the city lord's direct supervision. Any accusations you raise must be approved through him. And since we are currently standing in front of every noble present, he turned and gave a quiet command to Jiran of the White Sword Corps to arrest Charles right where he stood for questioning the city lord's authority. Charles continued desperately arguing his case. The city lord stepped forward and explained Davin was actually helping him. The Adenka family's tribunal only convenes once. If Charles pushed this further, he would face a higher level arbitration instead. Charles finally calmed down and apologized. Meanwhile, the priests were working frantically to restore Raze's right arm. The situation was not improving. Julian felt this was actually an opportunity and suggested Davin ask the priests whether a miracle stone could heal Raze's injury. It could, but whether to use it on him was entirely Davin's choice. Davin immediately saw a perfect move. He turned to Charles and told him if he wanted to save his son's life, he would have to offer his own right hand in exchange. Then Davin drew a sword and cut the rope binding Charles. Desperate Charles grabbed the sword without a second thought, but Davin had already signaled Jaron, and at the exact moment Charles lunged, Jaron delivered one diagonal slash that shattered the blade completely, stopping the tragedy before it happened. Charles nearly fainted on the spot. Davin kept his word and handed over the miracle stone. With its power, Raze's arm was fully restored. But whether they were enemies or allies, Davin still couldn't quite determine. When Davin returned to his room, a mysterious figure followed close behind. It was the priest Duran, the one who had just treated Raze. He had come to thank Davin, bringing the miracle stone as a gesture of gratitude. Davin weighed the value of the stone against what it represented in terms of his life and used that moment to help Duran understand his own shortcomings. In the end, Duran gave Davin a level 2 priest access card. Julian stared at it in complete shock. This means we can use all existing level 2 priest privileges. This is unbelievable. After Duran left, Davin and Julian were enjoying the outcome when Wilson suddenly burst through the door. The city lord had personally sent him with an invitation for Davin to join him for a meal. This was extraordinarily rare. Until now, only one person had ever eaten with the city lord, her second daughter, Dia. Beneath the woman's fringe were eyes she didn't dare let anyone see. For 14 years, she had never opened them. But the moment she first saw her stepson, she suddenly opened her eyes and directed a warning straight at him. Davin had come at the city lord's invitation. The city lord had two purposes in summoning her: first, to congratulate Davin on his victory at the sword assembly, and second, to understand his reaction to what Charles had said earlier. Then his stepmother suddenly fixed her gaze on Davin with a dead, empty stare. hair. Davin felt every hair on his body stand up simultaneously. He had never felt this kind of sensation before. Julian murmured quietly, stepmother possessed the eye of truth. No lie could escape her sight. But she detected absolutely no trace of apostle activity around Davin, which completely contradicted everything Charles had claimed. Then came the question of his swordsmanship. The city lord couldn't understand how someone incapable of forming a stellar image had managed to sever the arm of Reyes, a 2-star warrior. The stepmother felt Davin's swordsmanship resembled that of Hero Kagan, able to cut through any technique under certain conditions. She stepped forward again, activating the Eye of Truth, and demanded to know exactly where Davin had learned to fight like that. Just as Davin was about to answer, Julian rushed in and stopped him. He warned Davin not to improvise a lie carelessly because the stepmother would detect it instantly. He would handle this himself. But under the stepmother's relentless gaze, Julian froze completely, because the person he had feared most during his entire life was standing right in front of him. Davin couldn't wait any longer and told Julian to face his fear directly, then declared firmly, he had received a revelation. The stepmother's lungs nearly gave out. Someone without divine blessing receiving a revelation could only mean one thing: evil. Davin went numb. Julian had absolutely not prepared him for this development. Now the stepmother was questioning Davin even more intensely. If he couldn't explain himself clearly, she would send him to court for arbitration. At the critical moment, Julian finally stood up. He coached Davin on exactly what to say, and Davin delivered it without hesitation. If you question me, the temple will verify everything. If you believe I am evil, does that make the priest who gave me a 3-star miracle stone a fool? The reason my swordsmanship is this advanced is because I can observe sword techniques in a short time and then refine them through repeated practice afterward. That is how I will crush the Samian family and fulfill the one mission the Adenka ancestor left behind. The stepmother was speechless. Not a single word Davin had said was a lie. The city lord recognized the logic. While Davin's swordsmanship resembled Hero Kagan's, as long as Davin was declared to have been cursed by the Demon King, the Samian family would have nothing to say. And given his outstanding performance at the sword assembly, the city lord decided to grant him one wish. Julian immediately had Davin request permission to access the library, to use its resources to grow stronger. But the library required a 3-star warrior to enter, and the city lord wasn't certain Davin could form a stellar image in his heart. Davin genuinely couldn't, but that was precisely why he needed the library. The city lord smiled for the first time in what felt like years. As expected, this is the Adenka bloodline. He summoned the Red Lotus sword and presented to David. This was the legendary blade the city lord had carried through countless battle in his youth. His reputation across the world had begun the moment this sword was in his hands. Just as Davin was about to leave, his stepmother called him back. According to the tradition for sword assembly winners, Davin was required to challenge the Crimson Fortress, one of the Adenka family's training institutions, win a sword competition, receive a legendary blade, get immediately assigned to fight a demon. The stepmother knew that once Davin used that strange swordsmanship, his physical energy drained instantly. For that reason, she warned him, defeating the Crimson Demon inside could not rely on a single strike. In his current condition, he would be killed in an instant. The stepmother assumed Davin would ask her for help. He didn't. Davin buried himself in the warrior's library. He wanted to find historical records from 500 years ago, but after searching through 3 sleepless nights, nothing. Julian explained that the entire historical record from that period had vanished. The only remaining entry was the account of the hero hunting down the Demon King. Davin didn't have time to dwell on it. He needed to sharpen his swordsmanship and find a method for establishing a stellar image. Then Julian suddenly mentioned the ancestor Aslan, who had used the Demon King's swordsmanship, and their connection was far from ordinary. Julian wondered aloud whether Davin might actually be the Demon King himself. Davin finally decided to stop hiding it, but just as the words were halfway out, a sharp, piercing noise erupted inside Julian's mind. At first he thought it was a hallucination, then it happened again. The sound kept ringing and echoing. Davin went pale and immediately asked if he was alright. When the noise finally stopped, Julian stood completely still, drained of all expression. He no longer wanted to hear what Davin had been about to say. Then Davin's eyes landed on a book that looked completely out of place on the shelves. He was certain immediately this was exactly what he had been looking for. He flipped it open without hesitation. The contents were more than he'd hoped. Both of them read with pure delight, right up until they realized it was content not suitable for anyone under 18. But Davin felt there was something deeper hidden inside it. Someone had deliberately used this format to preserve important information. His eyes went wide. He was right. Inside was a recorded secret about traits and magical power. To make traits operate without manually guiding magical flow, and instead produce extraordinary results, one had to abandon the formation of stellar images entirely. Free magical power could maximize the effectiveness of traits to their absolute limit. Julian immediately objected. Using stellar images to accumulate power already carried risks. Abandoning defeating them entirely was another level of danger entirely, but Davin saw this as the perfect breakthrough. This body couldn't form stellar images to begin with, which meant this method had essentially been written specifically for him. He immediately wanted to go test it. As Davin stepped out of the library, an anxious girl called out to him, repeating over and over whether it was really true. She was Cell, the one and only servant who had never discriminated against Vincent before his death. Cell had heard from Wilson that he had grown stronger and changed completely, that he had defeated the strongest branch member Reyes and been given the chance to challenge the Crimson Fortress. Davin crouched down and reassured her. It was all true. While the two were catching up, Reyes suddenly appeared at the door. He said he had something important to tell Davin, but when they got to the room, Reyes' eyes suddenly blazed with fierce light. He drew his 8-meter great cleaver. Davin instinctively shifted into a combat stance. Then Reyes did something nobody in the room expected. He dropped to one knee in front of Davin. He had come to submit completely, to offer everything he had and serve under Davin's command. To prove his sincerity, he turned his blade handle first toward Davin. Davin drew his own sword and accepted, but made it clear. Betrayal would not be forgiven, not even slightly. Reyes noticed the Red Lotus sword and understood Davin had already been recognized by the city lord. He had absolutely no regrets about his decision. Cell stood to the side, eyes shining with warmth. Davin had completely transformed. He was no longer the failure everyone had spat on. Julian immediately came up with a plan. Show Reyes the method from the book and have him assist Davin in testing it. Reyes was happy to help, on the condition that Davin trust what he was about to tell him. And over the following days, under Reyes' guidance, Davin gradually began to control the flow of magical power. Reyes was genuinely in awe. A direct bloodline member doing something this insane, and succeeding while unable to even form a stellar image. Then suddenly Julian noticed something wrong and urgently told Davin to stop, otherwise the circuit could be destroyed entirely. He kept going. Reyes felt the same. Davin was clearly talented, but there was no need to rush this recklessly. Davin ignored them both and pushed to increase the flow speed, because from that moment he had understood, to become strong his life was the price. Davin strained to connect the two ends of the circuit. Reyes saw it and lunged forward to stop him, but Davin had already touched them together. For a moment he thought it had worked, then both ends of the magical power suddenly diverged. A thunderous explosion rocked the room. Reyes told him again. There was genuinely no need to throw away everything built so far just from impatience. He himself had taken a full 6 months to complete this. At that exact moment Rielsa was walking toward Davin's room. She opened the door and looked like she wanted to commit crime on the spot. She demanded to know what had happened. Davin said blandly that he had made a small mistake during meditation. Cell immediately exposed him. She wasn't sure what exactly they had been doing, but meditation does not cause explosions. Rielsa decided not to pursue the matter further, because there was something far more urgent to deliver. Davin had run out of time. The city lord had ordered him to break through the Crimson Fortress within 1 month. The mission had become critical. Rielsa hoped Davin would take this seriously. Davin was not only calm, he seemed almost pleased. He knew this was his father's expectation of him. Rielsa warned that until Davin broke through the fortress she would personally monitor his daily activity. Reyes knew that getting the divine blessing normally required at least 2 months. With a 1-month limit they needed another approach. But then something happened that left both Reyes and Julian completely speechless. Davin successfully gathered a closed magical spirit in his palm, which meant breaking through the Crimson Fortress wouldn't even take a month. It would take 2 weeks. 2 weeks later they arrived at a forest outside the city. Davin was ready to awaken his trait. As he gathered magical power in his hands, the power began splitting one by one, gradually forming countless ring-shaped circles of energy that in the next instant transformed into the image of a deity with a jagged hammer raised. He swung the hammer into the ground. A shockwave surged outward across the surface. A hurricane erupted instantly. Davin began his trait awakening. This was the blessing of the gods. A strange pattern appeared in Davin's hand. Reyes told him this was the successful awakening of Iron Will, defensive enhancement and body reinforcement. But Davin had received the divine blessing in under half a month. Reyes was completely overwhelmed by how fast this person moved. Davin thanked him and said there was one more thing he still needed Reyes' help with. 2 days later, the time to subjugate the Crimson Demon had arrived. Rielsa escorted them the entire way at the city lord's request, though her expression was one of pure helplessness. As far she knew, no one in the Adenka family had ever failed this trial. She did not want Davin's arrogance to make him the first. Davin smiled with quiet confidence and promised Rielsa he would absolutely exceed his father's expectations. They boarded a carriage. Rielsa worried the entire journey. She suspected Davin had no idea what this demon was actually like. Completely defeating it required multiple lethal attacks from a warrior of at least 3 stars. But from any angle Davin looked at, he was a warrior who hadn't even reached 1 star. He told Rielsa not to worry. A demon of this level required no research. He had already fought this exact demon 500 years ago. It was literally his first kill ever. He remembered it fondly. When they arrived, the area showed signs of a brutal battle having taken place there before. Rielsa Rielsa explained that everything here was a historical remnant commemorating the ancestor Aslan's victory over the great demon. Davin fell into thought. He was certain something else was hidden here. The 500 years of missing history had to be somewhere. Then Rielsa suddenly drew his sword and pointed it at the sky, activating a magical barrier technique, capable of controlling the number of enemies to an extreme degree. And then in front of Davin, a crimson demon appeared, holding a scythe. Davin immediately drew the red lotus sword and told Rielsa to watch what came next. The demon charged at full speed. Julian frantically told him to dodge, but only Davin knew, with a large weapon, creating distance leads to a long-range war. He had to engage directly, close combat, and he was right. Before the demon could swing the scythe down, it was already being forced to use the handle to block Davin's attack. Davin's eyes blazed. He whispered to the demon, "Your death was approaching." Then he kept swinging, blow after blow. The demon began to panic under the relentless assault and retreated step by step, no chance to counterattack. Davin was suppressing it perfectly across an entire skill tier, using nothing but the iron will trait. When he completed his final attack, Davin stepped on the demon's weapon handle and quickly pulled back, because he knew this type of demon had extreme aggression. Constant attacks would build its fury to the peak until it unleashed its most destructive strike, but that also meant every weakness would be fully exposed, making it far easier to find the sword path connecting them. Davin completed a flash step, and after taking that hit, the demon's body began breaking apart. Its main core was exposed. Davin had successfully slain the crimson demon, but Rielsa's face went pale, because the fight wasn't over. The blood-red bead, the demon's heart, and the demon that had been killed moments ago picked up its scythe and resurrected. It swung directly at Davin's face. Davin dropped into a crouch at the last second and the strike passed over his head. He had known this demon for 500 years. He remembered it having 2 lives. What he did not remember was that it had spent 500 years getting considerably angrier and considerably stronger. Davin felt genuine unease for the first time. Had this thing been evolving every single day for 5 centuries? The demon's appearance was indeed far more ferocious than it had been before. This was its self-activated berserker mode upon resurrection, and its power had multiplied dozens of times over. The demon's giant claw slammed down. Davin still managed to dodge, barely, but his remaining stamina was critically low. He was being backed into a corner. The demon gave him no breathing room and swung its 8-meter scythe down with full force. The back wall cracked just from the shockwave. Davin barely twisted aside in time. Another inch and he would have been reduced to ash. Julian's eyes had rolled back entirely. Julian told Davin they needed to change the original plan, but Davin didn't want to, because the demon was following the same logic as them: force the opponent into a corner, drain them completely, then unleash a single finishing blow. And Davin intended to use exactly that opening to find his breakthrough. Rielsa watched the situation turning against Davin and felt sick inside. As the monitoring official, she couldn't intervene. Doing so would only drag her into the failure record. But looking at Davin from a different angle, he reminded her of her own son. Long ago, Davin's mother Savannah had invited Rielsa to join her adventure party despite knowing about Rielsa's criminal past. Something about Savannah's strength had moved her. Or perhaps she had simply grown tired of a life built on theft. Either way, she had made her decision and joined. From that point on, Savannah led Rielsa through every battle, breaking through every barrier that came their way. In Rielsa's desperate life, Savannah's smile alone had been enough to heal everything. But then that day came. Savannah died giving birth to Davin. When Rielsa saw the child, she saw Savannah again. She understood in that moment that this wasn't the time for grief. Davin was the only thing Savannah had left behind. Rielsa bit down and made the decision. She would raise Davin to become a warrior respected across the entire nation. But she hadn't been able to hold that promise upright. For 14 years he had been persecuted daily by his own siblings. Rielsa had regretted her decision many times over those 14 years, until the moment the city lord bestowed the red lotus sword on Davin, and Rielsa finally felt that none of those years had been wasted. But now Davin was facing death, and all she could do was watch and pray for a miracle. Just as the demon swung down its full power strike, Davin suddenly thought, could this be the moment? A figure flashed by at blinding speed. It was Ray's, the 2-star warrior. He had stepped in front of Davin and taken the demon's killing blow, and Davin was sitting cross-legged to the side meditating. Ray's wasn't even angry. Instead, he was fired up, determined to be the one who cut this demon down himself. What he didn't know yet was that he would regret this decision. Under the demon's relentless barrage of swings, Ray's blade began developing cracks. A terrible premonition grew with each blow. Finally, it couldn't hold. The blade shattered completely. Ray's went numb. He had no choice but to catch the demon's scythe with his bare hands. As he poured every last ounce of strength into holding it, Davin finally completed his meditation. The sword energy he unleashed split the demon's body clean in two. With a thunderous crash, the demon's core exploded. Together they had defeated the Crimson Demon. But Rielsa wasn't satisfied. She didn't think this proved anything beyond what the city lord already expected. Davin immediately disagreed. The barrier you set up was supposed to limit it to one demon. There's another one that got through. I had Ray's help as a test, to see how you'd handle it. Then Davin pulled out the miracle stone and crushed it between his teeth. All attributes doubled instantly. Stamina restored. And now, the real battle was his moment to prove himself. Facing the second demon closing in from above, Davin didn't panic at all. He raised his sword sword and began channeling power. One precise strike landed cleanly on the demon's critical point. As the demon activated its second life, Daven immediately followed with one horizontal slash, and with just a few exchanges, successfully killed it. Rielsa was completely dazed. When had this boy become this strong? But Daven had already far exceeded his own body's limits. This broken vessel of a body could not sustain 4 consecutive sword path severances in a row. Julian urgently rushed over, telling him to lie down and rest. But Daven said, this situation was exactly like the sword assembly. He had to stay standing until the very end. That was the only way to prove his victory was real. Then, directly above them, a summoning array appeared out of nowhere. Rielsa immediately went into combat readiness, but as far as she knew, nothing like this had ever occurred here before. A purple core in the sky began absorbing rubble, and what materialized before them was the ruins guardian of this place. This location existed to commemorate the ancestor Aslan, and the guardian would obey the commands of the Adenka family. Rielsa immediately issued a retreat warning to the guardian. The guardian answered with a wide-open jaw of fangs. The long years of historical accumulation had erased all its memory of everything. Rielsa decided to stop holding back, but the guardian had already locked her in place. Then, the guardian's body was suddenly encased in ice. Rielsa delivered one heavy slash and destroyed it instantly. Reyes watched with his jaw on the floor. This was the true power of a 7-star warrior. Absurdly strong didn't even begin to cover it. But Daven said, it wasn't over yet. Using the last scraps of energy he had left, he swung out one final streak of sword energy. Where it struck, a flying insect appeared. Its tail was embedded with a magical stone. This was the guardian's true form. Exposed, it immediately charged straight at Reyes. Rielsa flash-stepped between them and cut it down with a single instant slash. Gone. Then Daven spotted a treasure chest. Rielsa stepped forward and opened it. Inside, the skeletal remains of a dragon, most likely a hidden reward left behind by the ancestor Aslan. Julian was vibrating with excitement. Dragon bones were priceless, an extraordinarily rare magical material. Daven had found it first. Rielsa said it belonged to him, but any treasure discovered unexpectedly like this had to go through the church for review. If it came out that Rielsa had opened it without authorization, the punishment would be severe. Daven drew his sword and split the dragon bone in two. He was making Rielsa a co-conspirator. That way the church couldn't touch either of them alone. When everything was done, Rielsa found the city lord and reported everything that had happened, presenting the dragon bone Daven had given her. The city lord immediately ordered her to destroy it, but even under Rielsa's full power strike, the dragon bone didn't show even a hairline crack. The city lord said her current power was genuinely not enough. Only by raising her forging level to the highest tier would she be able to break it. The city lord's gaze drifted to the sword on the tombstone carving. He murmured quietly, this time it is finally my turn.